Hello, everybody. My name is Daithí de Buitléir. If you have any problems at all or any questions during this webinar, please just pop any queries or any issues into the Q&A or any questions. So I suppose we'll kick off. Hopefully this will be around 25 minutes of a kind of little bit of insight work, and then we'll have some time for questions at the end. So just to give a little bit of background on myself, my name is Daithí de Buitléir from Park Office. We're the world's leading employee parking management software. And every day we work with companies all over the world solving their employee parking issues. And I suppose one of the kind of interesting things we've noticed over the last couple of years is we've been working with, companies from some of the biggest in the world to companies with, 5 parking spaces and 10 employees, is there's no best practice when it comes to employee parking management. And that doesn't really make sense, because the same problems tend to come to the fore again and again and again. And really there's only 3 to 4 key parking issues and challenges. But everybody is kind of working in their own silo, trying to come up with ways to solve these. And that's why we have all these kind of messy cultures around parking, where there's a member of admin staff running massive Excel sheets or WhatsApp groups or all sorts of things that ultimately just isn't a particularly effective way of managing parking. Compounding that, I suppose, is COVID. So employee parking has obviously changed a lot over the last year or so, and that for a lot of people it's kind of simply disappeared as they've worked from home. But as we kind of gear back up across the world to return to offices, we're going to see more change in the employee parking landscape in the next 12 months than we have in the last 12 years. And I suppose to kind of help companies navigate this journey, we want to help people understand what is happening out there, and to start conversations that will see best practices start to emerge, and people will begin to understand, okay, there's a right way and a wrong way to do a lot of this sort of thing. So that's why we've gone and we've created the State of Employee Parking 2021. So this is a trends and insights analysis of what's happening in the world of employee parking. So we handpicked 105 employee parking leaders from 15 countries around the world. So these, when we talk about employee parking leaders, and we'll dig into this a little bit in a minute, we talk about people who are the ultimate decision makers for parking and parking policy in their own businesses. And when we went out and talked to people, we made sure that we got a very broad range of company size, industry, so on and so forth. So we've everything here from companies with 10 employees and 5 parking spaces, as I mentioned, right up to 20,000 employees and 10,000 parking spaces, and even more in some cases. So I suppose there's 2 sections to what we're going to look at today. Section number 1 is to look at kind of employee parking management as a whole, and then the second is going to dig down a little bit more into some of the COVID impacts. So just to give an idea, we would have conducted all research and outreach for this piece of research in January, February of this year. So kind of still, obviously, COVID was a massive challenge and issue for a lot of people, as it will remain. But I suppose we started off by asking people who's involved in decisions around employee parking management in their companies. And this is one thing we would see a lot as we engage and talk to companies, that parking, for one reason or another, has never really had a home. And we can kind of see that in one company. We might be talking to a head of IT, and then we might be talking to their biggest competitor, and we're talking to facilities or HR, and they have the same problem, but it's ownership of that is living in a different vertical. So what we can see here is we can see a kind of relatively clear picture of senior management and facilities being most likely to have ownership. And we'll dig into the senior management question in a minute because it's very interesting. And then a kind of real spread across a number of other verticals. The senior management thing is really, really interesting because you've 32% of employee car parks being managed by senior management. Over half of these respondents had more than 50 employees. So in a small business, you know, maybe if there's only 6 or 7 employees, does it make sense for the CEO or the owner to, you know, directly dictate parking policy? And potentially in some cases it does. It's a relatively centralized power base in a business. But when you're getting up to having 50 plus employees, does it really make any sense at all for your most valuable people, people who don't have any experience in commuter policy or transportation, and who are spending large amounts of their time and making decisions around employee parking, oftentimes administrating or overseeing the administration of very complex manual processes. And so that if that's something that's kind of happening in a business, it's probably something that needs to stop. Then the second thing, and this would align a lot with what we would tend to see, is only just over 4% of employee parking leaders come from HR functions. And this is something that always surprises us, how little interest HR professionals tend to have in employee parking. Yet ultimately, like, I think it's 23% of people have left a job at some time in their life because the commute was too difficult or too onerous. So I think there's a broad question there for people in all businesses as they look to build, you know, stakeholder buy-in across the business for improving employee parking processes. Is can HR afford to be so lax about something which is ultimately a key pillar of the employee experience? And then finally, and one of the most interesting things to keep an eye on over the next 10 years is going to be the growth of both workplace experience and transport demand functions. So for many of you on this webinar, you might be very familiar, or in fact, you might work in these particular functions. But for many people, these might be very new terms. So let me just take a minute to explain. Workplace experience is kind of like where HR meets facilities. These are people whose jobs ultimately it is to make the office as attractive a place to work as possible. And these will be very popular in large tech companies right across the world. And then we have the transportation demand management function. So this will be something that would mainly only be found in certain pockets of the US. And basically these people their full-time job is to manage how employees commute to and from the office. And this is a very popular and growing market, which is, I suppose, used quite heavily by bigger employers around some of the US's largest urban bases. I suppose the next thing we had a look at was how big, or if employee parking is a problem for companies. And ultimately, it's kind of a 50-50 split. And when you dig into that a little bit more, there is some fascinating insight. So 62% of companies with over 1,000 employees report employee parking problems. That makes a massive amount of sense. The more people have to come to work every day, the harder it is for them all to find somewhere to park or to travel on alternative methods. When you dig into, and we're going to dig in a little more into kind of parking policies, when you actually look at it, companies who operate a fixed designated parking policy, so that is, let's say, you know, senior management have fixed ownership of a certain space and they can use that every day at their leisure. And these are companies who are most likely to have employee parking problems. And I suppose on a positive for ourselves, only 25% of companies who've implemented employee parking software report any remaining issues. So we've never, and anybody who's engaged with Park Office and the team, we've never promised to be a silver bullet to solve all parking problems, but we will solve the vast majority of them. And it's great to see increasing evidence across the whole industry, that software has a massive role to play in eradicating some, if not all, employee parking problems for businesses. Then we started to dig a little more into, okay, what are the biggest problems? And there's some really kind of interesting stuff here. So when you actually look at it, you can kind of see that we've 32% can't find extra space, 41% have a lack of space at the office. So that's 73% of all parking problems, or of the predominant parking problems experienced by companies, are space related, which in some ways doesn't make for a massive surprise. And when you dig into that more and you start looking at verticals of employee numbers, you can see that bigger employers are much more likely to have space issues, which makes a massive amount of sense. But the real standout figure for me here is how low a concern environmental issues are. And we have another question that looks at the environment a little later, but only 1 in 20 businesses' primary purchasing behavior around employee parking is driven by the environment, which ultimately that's something that's going to have to change over the next 10, 15, 20 years. Companies need to come up with policies, and they need to come up with software and solutions that are going to help them strategically reduce the amount of people who are parking at work. And then I suppose one thing which makes a lot of sense is that employers with less than 50 employees were twice as likely to have budgetary issues. So SMEs, particularly the S side of that, just simply don't have the budget to compete with larger employers around provision of parking as a perk, and around building the infrastructure to do that in a way that is environmentally responsible. Then when we had a look at how people are managing their car parks, we can still see by far and away that manual management is the most popular, but obviously in a positive for companies like ourselves, software is starting to gain traction, and that's something we predict will grow and grow and grow over the next number of years. One of the really interesting things is that over half companies over 100 employees are still managing their parking manually, and that, to be honest, for me, it just boggles. I just, like, if you have loads of employees, it's just so hard to manage them manually, like when, you know, software can do it in the click of a button. And I think that that's going to be a segment of the market that is aggressively going to digitize over the next couple of years. And probably equally interesting is the whole area of outsourcing. So a lot of companies out there are outsourcing their parking management. Now they outsource to different types of companies. So some people outsource to property management companies or facilities management. Some people outsource to security companies. Some people will outsource to a traditional parking management operator who would tend to specialize in maybe multi-story car parks, but also would do some bespoke auxiliary services for large-scale corporates in their area. What we're going to see in this area is really what software can do is what a lot of them companies have traditionally been offering into the market, but software can just do it a lot better, a lot cheaper, and more effectively and efficiently. So we're starting to see the leaders in this outsourcing sphere are starting to come on board as channel partners for leading parking management softwares like Park Office. And I suppose what they do is they proactively bring cutting edge solutions like ours to their clients, and then they monetize the implementation of rollout. And that is a way for them not only to provide a better service, but also for their businesses to thrive moving forward. Because in 10, 15 years time, I just don't think we're going to have many companies paying, you know, 10, 50, 100, 200,000 euro dollars or even more in some large scale corporates to kind of a security company or a property management company to kind of have someone standing at a barrier with a clipboard checking who's going in and out every day. It doesn't really make sense. Then we decided to dig into employee parking policies. So there's 3 main ways that people manage parking across the world. First come, first serve, which is relatively explanatory. It's the daily space race. If you're there early enough, you get it. And designated parking, which we kind of touched on earlier, that's certain staff are assigned car parking spaces which they can use as they please. And then the third is paid parking. So that's people paid to park at work. And I suppose then there's a fourth kind of segment, which is a mixture of 2 or 3 of the above. Now, what we can kind of see here is we can see a bit of a kind of 3-way split between first come, first serve, designated and mixed. But when you dig into it a bit more and actually analyze it, there's over 70% of employers are designating some or all of their parking to fixed staff members, which isn't an efficient use of space or resource. And we've seen it to be the most problematic of all employee parking policies. And we're going to dig into a little bit more later on as to the impact of flexible working and how that has made this model for managing employee car parking obsolete. 27.6% of all employers have a first come, first serve model. And this is interesting because it's easily the most environmentally unfriendly. So if you operate a first come, first serve model, ultimately there is zero deterrent there for people to not drive to work. Particularly even in cases where you might have 200 staff and 150 people who like to, or sorry, 150 people who like to drive to work and 100 spaces. Everyone will drive to work still on the off chance of there being a space. And that's proven to be incredibly inefficient around journey times, emissions, congestion, and will tend to lead to massive traffic issues coming in and out of offices, and also to just a lot of disappointed employees. And then I suppose the kind of final part of this particular jigsaw is paid parking. So paid parking is obviously still a very small part of the industry, but it's something that we're rapidly going to see grow over the next 10 years. And there's a very simple reason for that. I think the concept of charging people to park at work is alien for a lot of people, but increasingly policymakers around the world are waking up and they're realizing that the biggest deterrent for people to commute to work on a daily basis in their car alone is to actually charge them. Now that can be a nominal fee of €5 a day or $5 a day, but it's just that there is something that makes them think, oh, is this work? Okay, will I go another way? And it's just to start to deter people. Because I think everybody here today recognizes that employee parking is always going to have a role at the workplace, but it can't always be as is now. And it can't always be this free for all with hundreds and thousands of people landing in who don't necessarily need to be driving every day. People who could live, 2 kilometers from the office and could easily walk or cycle, or, people who live on public transport routes who are driving to work out of habit. And the world can't afford for people to travel like that forever. So more and more we're going to see kind of paid parking, and people move away from first come, first serve to kind of help eradicate that. And I suppose that bridges nicely into environmental impact. So when we ask people, is the negative impact of employee parking on the environment a bigger concern for you now than it was 5 years ago? The heartening news is that 60% of people said yes. The disheartening news is just over 40% said no. And when you kind of dig into that a bit more, it's bigger companies are more worried about the environment. We can also see that the bigger they get, the more likely they are to be worried. And interestingly enough, companies in the US are more likely to be worried about the environment than companies in the EU. And that's probably, and for anybody who's not familiar and has an interest in any of this sort of stuff, that's probably because the US has a much more advanced legislative framework where basically companies in many big cities have to agree transport quotas with the local governments. And if they don't, so a transport quota is, I have 5,000 employees, I agree that only 2,000 of them are going to drive to work over the next 2 years, 1,000 of them are going to take public transport, and so on and so forth. And then if they don't actually hit them transport quotas, in cases there can be fines. And so that kind of has created a whole discourse around a lot of this in the US, which is starting to creep in to the EU. And I know that there's different initiatives being rolled out across different countries. So that's kind of the state of play in and around employee parking. And then I suppose we dug into a couple of extra questions around COVID and the impact of COVID. So the first question was, are you worried the rise in flexible parking will make employee parking harder to manage? And there is only one answer to this. Flexible working is going to make parking a lot harder to manage. If you think with relatively fixed journey patterns, the amount of difficulty businesses have had in managing parking, like it's only going to get harder. And what I mean by that is, to date, the average business knew, okay, I have 300 employees. I know on average 250 of them are in the office every day. I can make, and I know that most of my staff are going to be here, 70, 80, 90% of the time. And I can create parking policies off the back of that. And that still was an absolute nightmare for a lot of companies. Now most companies are going to move into an era where they don't know who's going to be in when. People might be in 1 day a week, they could be in 4 days a week, they could be in 2 days a week. And that variability and flexibility is going to become massive. Now, in the short term, that might give certain people relief. Like we've seen a lot of companies are struggling for space. But what we are going to see is as those companies get people back to work, they can't afford to have 200 people in a car, or 200 car parking spaces and only 60 people using them on a daily basis. So they need to come up with ways of managing and forecasting what expected daily demand is going to be, and to start then creating, I suppose, real estate, just start to make sure they have the right real estate footprint to meet those demands. So when, again, you start to break down on verticals here, you can see companies with 1,000 employees were most likely to see flexible parking making employee parking harder to manage. And oftentimes when you get to companies at this scale, they have specialists within the business who understand commuting policy, understand parking, and are spending a lot of their time looking to figure out what this is all going to mean for their workplaces, which is a luxury that some smaller companies just simply don't have. Companies who manage parking manually were almost twice as likely to be worried about increasing challenges presented by flexible working. This obviously, again, makes a massive amount of sense. It's, as we've touched upon earlier, it's that increased variability. It's just going to be too much for a person on a spreadsheet or a person in a WhatsApp group to manage. And then finally, employees with less than 50 spaces were most likely to be uncertain about what the future holds. And that's very understandable too. Like, I think there's a lot of companies who've been fighting for their lives over the last 12 to 15 months. Maybe they haven't got the time or headspace to think about parking yet. But they are going to start to think about it quite quickly as companies start to come back to the office, and as they realize that the way their company is structured is no longer fit for purpose. And then the final question we asked people was, has COVID changed our company's outlook on employee parking? And what we can see here is we can see 3 distinct groups. We can see roughly half of companies simply haven't got around to thinking about this yet, and they're in a no change kind of position. But then we can see 2 very differing kind of verticals here. We can see companies who are looking to increase parking as a result of COVID, and companies who are looking to decrease parking as a result of COVID. Now, what we know is that bigger companies are much more likely to be looking to reduce the amount of parking they have at work. So this is something we touched upon on the previous slide, where, flexible working, they're not going to have the same amount of people into the office every day. They have the resource and expertise to invest in, I suppose, remote working infrastructure at scale, and to ensure that they can cultivate the corporate culture that they want in a hybrid working model. Smaller businesses are much more worried about this, and they are much more eager to get their staff back to work. And when I mean back to work, I mean back to the office. So 61.5% of companies looking to boost parking space or increase their parking space have less than 100 employees. And these are companies, I suppose, who feel a key part of their USP is their office experience and the collaboration that unlocks. They recognize that a lot of their staff are hesitant to maybe return to public transport while COVID is still an issue. And as a result, are actually looking to increase their parking footprint in the short term anyway, because they feel that this will be necessary to incentivize people to return to work. And then, as we kind of touched on already, there's that kind of 50% who don't know whether they're coming or going quite yet. But I would think that these people are very quickly, as we've mentioned, going to realize, oh, their need for the office has changed and our need for parking has changed. And I suppose they're going to come at it a little bit behind the curve. And, you know, for some companies, that's no major disadvantage. But I think particularly for larger companies who are bringing, you know, anything really above 50 employees back to the office, you kind of want it to be relatively smooth or plain sailing from day one. So I suppose that is the kind of key insights we have to share here today. If we want to take some time for any questions, I know there's one or two has popped up, which I'll come to there in a second. But if there's anything here today that has been of interest, or anything that has you worried or concerned, or any opportunities you see, please reach out to the team at parkoffice.io. We are working with many of the world's leading employers solving all of these problems, and we have a collective expertise that is really, really deep. People often ring us up and they're in a bit of a state, to be honest, because they have what they think is an unsolvable parking problem. But we've seen it before, and we've probably solved it 100 times. So look, hopefully moving forward, I know a lot of people here today are already either happy customers and clients, or are people who are actively engaging and talking to members of the team. So hopefully we can help all of you guys manage this transition and ensure that employee parking is, it just isn't a problem really. So thanks very much for your time. And if anyone has any questions, please make sure to throw them in. So the first question I have here is Brenda Quigley. How can I convince my company to change our parking culture from a mostly designated arrangement to flexible parking? So I suppose that's a good question, Brenda, and I think it comes down to what exactly your company's culture is. But if I can assume that you, like a lot of companies, you've been away from the office quite a lot, or a large amount of your staff have been away from the office for the last kind of 15 months, I think a lot of people are going to realize that they just can't afford that wastage anymore. As they come back, if your company are bringing staff back and they're planning on being there for kind of, you know, 1, 2, 3 days a week, you can't really afford to just be leaving 50, 60, 70% of your parking spaces lying empty all the time. Like, it's just a real massive waste of resource that's going to end up costing your company thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions a euro a year. So I think hybrid working, and I think a major benefit that we have seen since the start of the pandemic is, with the pandemic, a whole new suite of digital tools came into the lexicon or vocab for a lot of people, and stuff like Zoom, Slack, so on and so forth. And I think as companies gear back to return to the office, that they are going to employees expect and are comfortable with a new suite of tools that are going to allow them to do that, and to make, you know, a parking management software like Park Office part of that conversation, alongside potentially other PropTech solutions that companies are looking at. I think that employees are going to be very comfortable with that, and they're going to understand that that is par for the course as they look to return to the office. So I'm not sure if we've any other questions there. If you do, if you want to throw them into the chat. Cool. Sure. If not, thanks a million for your time today. And as I said, if there's anything you'd like to pick up with myself or the team on a one-to-one basis, we look forward to engaging with you in the future. And we'll circulate all this content to everybody who's been here today and everyone who's registered. And yeah, you're more than welcome to share internally and share on LinkedIn, so on and so forth. And thanks a million for your time, and look forward to hearing from you in the future. Bye now.